you all for coming today. Good afternoon. My name is Bill Shambra, and I'm director of Hudson Institute's Bradley Center for Philanthropy and Civic Renewal. Kristen McIntyre and I welcome you to today's panel entitled, What is Conservative Philanthropy? A special welcome to our many fans viewing us, no doubt, over Ustream. But first, our customary preview of coming attractions. As many of you know, several years ago, the city of Bell in California went through a particularly humiliating version of the bankruptcy that's now haunting a number of cities in the Bear Flag Republic. And what you may not know is that Bell is battling its way back to solvency in a particularly interesting and instructive fashion, namely by directly and actively engaging the citizenry of the town in the difficult decisions it now has to make about its future. In other words, the city has turned a severe fiscal crisis into an opportunity for the sort of civic renewal that the Bradley Center studies and celebrates. So on October 26th, mark your calendars for October 26th, noon to 2, we're going to hear about the civic rebirth of Bell, California from someone who helped bring it about, namely Pete Peterson, Executive Director of the Davenport Institute at Pepperdine University. And he'll bring with him a couple of folks, a couple of residents of Bell who participated in the process, so that you will have a rare opportunity to hear from people who, from the West Coast, who actually participated in this process. Now, for today's panel, I should note that it's something of a bookend to another panel we held last year entitled, What is Social Justice Philanthropy? Just as it would have been difficult to find a more knowledgeable and thoughtful representative of social justice philanthropy than our lead speaker on that occasion, Albert Ruesga of the Greater New Orleans Foundation, so today it would have been difficult to find a more knowledgeable and thoughtful representative of conservative philanthropy than Jim Piereson. Jim directed the truly legendary John M. Olin Foundation until it closed its doors several years ago, and now directs the William E. Simon Foundation in New York City. But more important, no one within the leadership of conservative philanthropy has thought more deeply and written more clearly about its ends and means than Jim Piereson. That should have been evident in his essay from the May 2005 issue of Commentary magazine that we assigned as reading for this session, which was entitled Investing in Conservative Ideas. It's 7 years old. We're a little behind in our material, but nonetheless, I think as you saw, it still has a great deal to tell us about conservative philanthropy, and he'll be bringing us up to date with his reflections today. And then we'll hear from members of our truly distinguished panel. First, Stephen Tellis, professor of political science at Johns Hopkins, who's been an acute observer of conservative philanthropy and whose book on the topic, The Rise of the Conservative Legal Movement, I highly recommend. It's an extremely sophisticated and thoughtful treatment of the conservative legal movement. Next, Lenore Ely, currently editor of a journal entitled Conversations in Philanthropy. I think there are copies available over here. And you're this year's president for the Philadelphia Society, right? Yes, you are indeed. And I should add that Lenore is something of the intellectual executor for the late Richard Cornell, who is one of the founders of modern conservative philanthropy. And finally, Gara LaMarche, senior fellow at New York University's Robert F. Wagner School of Public Service, and a longtime executive in various distinctly non-conservative philanthropies. Jim, you can.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Bill. Happy to see you again. Happy to be here with the Hudson Institute. Happy to be here with my friends on the panel. Thank you. That article I wrote 7 years ago was a kind of a look backwards at what conservative philanthropy had been in the post-war period and it ended with some speculations about the future. So let me, in these remarks, kind of go back and cover some of that ground again, and then try to perhaps bring it up to date with what I see having happened over the past many years and where we might be headed in the future. The Hudson Institute has given as a title for this session a question that I am unable to answer. What is conservative philanthropy? It's a question that admits of many answers, depending upon what we mean by conservative or philanthropy, or by the two terms linked together, or by what we judge to be the critical tendencies of this particular moment. None can be answered with precision. And so instead of discussing the subject from an abstract point of view, I'd like to discuss it in terms of what conservative philanthropy has been and what it might yet become. Now, of course, the conservative philanthropy, like the conservative movement, has exploded in size over the past 3 or so decades. So there are many different styles of conservative philanthropy. Unfortunately, I'll have to gloss over that. I serve on the boards of 3 conservative foundations, and they all do something distinctly different. First, to speak generally about conservatism and taking but a modest degree of historical license, one might say that there have been 2 traditions of conservative thought since that paradigm first emerged around the time of the French Revolution. As we understand it, conservatism has developed in tandem with the liberal revolution in politics and economics. First, there is the tradition originating with Burke that leverages the language of prudence and tradition to the defense of representative government, the rule of law, etc. In other words, to the defense of liberal institutions. This is an enduring theme. Conservatism brings something from outside liberal thought to the defense of liberal institutions. This was thought to be so obvious for most of our history that few statesmen or philosophers felt it necessary to articulate conservatism as a doctrine in its own right. The emergence of the conservative movement in contemporary times was a sign that such an assumption could no longer be taken for granted. Others have argued along these lines that it is necessary to preserve pre-liberal institutions, namely church, family, local governments, and voluntary associations, as the foundations for markets and representative government. This was another way of making the case described above. Liberal institutions cannot stand entirely on their own and require support from the outside, as it were. This is the claim made by Tocqueville, somewhat differently by Schumpeter, that capitalism and democracy depend upon the preservation of pre-liberal or even non-liberal cultural institutions. Neither writer was especially optimistic that such pillars of liberty could in fact be preserved. The second tradition is that of classical liberalism, which strictly speaking is something quite different from conservatism. The classical liberals suggest that market capitalism can stand on its own foundations without external support from the kinds of institutions discussed before. They doubt conservatives doubt the claim, made best by Hayek, that market systems generate their own spontaneous order of supporting institutions. For his part, Hayek declared that he was not a conservative at all, and did not think that conservatives could succeed in holding back the tide of leftism because they made a traditional and practical case rather than a principled, philosophical, or ideological one. Hayek and his followers sought to establish classical liberalism as the principled alternative to socialism and statist liberalism. Nevertheless, modern conservatives and classical liberals have generally been able to work toward a common goal of limiting the reach of the state and the intrusion of politics into the life of civil society, even though they disagreed on some fundamental assumptions. In the article I wrote in 2005, I tried to say that conservative philanthropy in the post-war era has structured itself around these two traditions of conservatism, each developed in response to historical events, the first to the New Deal and the rise of the welfare state, the second to the Great Society and the Cultural Revolution of the 60s. In both cases, conservative philanthropists, including the classical liberals in this camp, looked to books and ideas for guidance to a surprising degree, despite critics who viewed the concept of conservative ideas as a contradiction in terms. I expressed a concern near the end of that article that this emphasis was giving way to a greater focus on politics and the nuts and bolts of policy. There is nothing wrong with these foci, I suggested, except that there is a stronger rationale for them if they are organized around more general aims and objectives and a broader understanding of the ends of political life. The first tradition was one of classical liberalism, as I wrote in the article, originated in the 40s and guided by Hayek's The Road to Serfdom. Published in Great Britain in 1944, a condensed version of the book published by Reader's Digest sold 2 million copies in the USA. The Hayekian philanthropists were generally businessmen, often leaders of large corporations. Their campaign was to save liberty and the free enterprise system from collectivist assaults, either from socialists or New Dealers, because Hayek had written that the welfare state was just a way station on the road to socialism. The Hayekian philanthropists disdained politics and policy arguments and set about preparing the next generation of teachers and journalists to make the case for the free society. The Hayekian philanthropists built up an impressive network of academic and journalistic supporters through the 50s and 60s, but were generally swallowed up by the cultural tsunami that rolled over the country in the 1960s. Classical liberalism was further outside the mainstream in 1968 than it was in 1946. In my article, I judged this to be a principled movement, but also a failed one. The second tradition was that of neoconservatism that arose in the 70s in response to the cultural assault of the 60s. The neoconservatives came from the left, accepted the New Deal, not necessarily the Great Society, dismissed the argument for free enterprise, and placed great weight on cultural arguments in defense of the family, religion, and the institutions of civil society. They took their bearings from the likes of Burke, Schumpeter, Tocqueville, Orwell, Madison and Hamilton, and even Aristotle. Most were writers and editors. Few were academics. None that I know was an economist. They were essayists and editors, used to making arguments about politics and culture, and in contrast to the Hayekians, they wanted to address immediate controversies. Far more than the classical liberals, they were interested in foreign policy, religion, and culture. Irving Kristol said late in his life that he had never read The Road to Serfdom. Kristol and the neoconservatives defended capitalism, but insisted that it was part of a network of institutions that could not stand on its own. As he wrote in one essay, titled one essay, "Two Cheers for Capitalism." The neoconservatives exercised great influence over the conservative foundations that developed in the 1970s and 80s, including Olin, Smith-Richardson, Scaife, and the Bradley Foundations. This period, roughly from the 1980 to the early 2000s, was one of enormous success and growth for conservatism in general and for conservative philanthropy in particular, as many of the ideas and doctrines that they sponsored were brought into the public arena. Supply-side economics, across-the-board tax cuts, law and economics, the military buildup, strategic defense initiative, aggressive stance in the Cold War, deregulation, anti-crime and safe streets campaigns, welfare reform, and many others. There were some spectacular successes: the Reagan economy, the long bull market, the Gulf War, the fall of the Soviet Union, the Gingrich Revolution, the success of welfare reform, the evolution of the charter school movement, to name just a few. In that period, the reformers in American politics were generally conservatives, and much of what they promoted brought surprising success. So much so that there were liberals just a few years ago who began to plot their comeback by appropriating that model for their own purposes, and with a great deal of success, I might add. Perhaps in retrospect, the Olin Foundation closed its doors at an appropriate moment, because entering the 2000s, this run of good fortune was about to come to an end. It is difficult to pinpoint the moment at which this turnabout began. Perhaps it was on 9/11, or when U.S. troops failed to find weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, or when the insurgency in that country got out of hand. There followed other developments: the congressional elections of '06, the real estate collapse, financial crisis that erupted in the middle of the '08 campaign, the rise of Obama, stimulus, healthcare reform, and the general confusion as to how to defend market capitalism and a robust American role abroad in the wake of these developments. At the end of that article, that 205 article, I noted that conservative philanthropy was about to enter a third phase, but I could not foresee any of the developments that fundamentally reshaped the intellectual and political landscape. There is little doubt that what we call conservatism is in a state of flux as we look for a way forward. That is also true of liberalism, but that is a story for another day. The liberals at least have a political leader around whom they can rally, which is not true of the conservatives. Let me make a few observations by way of updating my remarks from '05 and describing where I think conservative philanthropy is today and where it might go. These are what I would call back-of-the-envelope observations and have no necessary historical or scientific validity. 1. Conservative philanthropy has evolved from a movement of ideas in the '70s to one more focused on policy today. Conservative philanthropies have become adept at promoting concepts like charter schools, school choice, core curricula, health savings accounts, tax reform, entitlement reform, balanced budgets, and so on. Staff and board members are now more likely to ask about a particular project, what is the payoff in policy? Large ideas, such as those advanced in the '80s by the likes of Michael Novak, Samuel Huntington, or Alan Bloom, are less in evidence in conservative discussions. The influence of, quote, New York intellectuals, small magazines, and cultural criticism is less than it was a few decades ago. 2. Conservatism has evolved from a movement independent and outside of the major parties to one that is almost wholly identified with the Republican Party. In the '70s and '80s, many conservatives were estranged liberals and Democrats who hoped to exercise influence over both parties. That is no longer true. Conservatives today are almost completely associated with the Republican Party. Indeed, there are few independent intellectuals around today on either side of the ideological fence. 3, and this is a controversial assertion, there is also the surprising disappearance of neoconservatism as an influential public doctrine. This, as I said, is a controversial statement. There are several factors at work here, including the way the intervention in Iraq transpired and the fact that neoconservatives unfairly were blamed for everything that went wrong there. The financial crisis has forced political debate in economic and financial directions, not the strong suit of the neoconservatives. Many of the basic ideas of neoconservatism have been absorbed into the broader conservative movement, and the battles they engage over crime, welfare, the collapse of the cities, educational failure, and the Cold War have either been won or subordinated to new conflicts. Finally, many of the formerly influential neoconservatives have passed from the scene, including Irving Kristol, Gene Kirkpatrick, D.P. Moynihan, and James Q. Wilson. 4, the retreat of neoconservatism has led to another surprising development, namely the revival of Hayek and classical liberalism as the effective answer to the growth of government in the wake of the financial crisis. The evolution of events has crystallized conservative argument into something resembling Hayek's position in defense of free markets, capitalism, and spontaneous order. Hayek is more influential on the right than he was a few decades ago, and more influential than the neoconservatives, Schumpeter, Orwell, Burke, or any of the other thinkers who sought to save liberalism from itself. Ironically, an intellectual movement that I judged to be a failure in 2005 has revived itself under the pressures of the financial crisis and the fundamental challenge to capitalism. There are many signs of this. For example, the last Republican vice president was noted for his links to neoconservatives, while the current candidate cites Hayek as an important influence on his thought. 5, the decades of the 1970s and 80s were periods of institutional invention on the conservative side, with the founding and evolution of magazines, think tanks, book publishers, academic programs, and the like, often with funds supplied by conservative foundations. That is much less the case today, when conservative foundations and conservative institutions are more focused on building out, quote unquote, from the infrastructure created in those earlier decades and adapting their message to the internet, YouTube, Twitter, and the like. If one asks why conservatives might be less interested in broad ideas today, this might provide one of the answers. These points are part and parcel of the growth of conservatism and conservative philanthropy from a movement generally at the margins of political debate to one that has fought its way into the political mainstream. Having done so, it has rendered the mainstream more contentious and unstable, at the same time as large events are threatening to overthrow it altogether. The challenges facing the United States today are so massive that they cannot be addressed or resolved within the current structure of party politics and intellectual debate. The long political cycle that began in the 1930s, fueled by unprecedented prosperity but also by debt, American power, and the U.S. dollar, is approaching an end. Conventional opinion holds that it can be stretched out indefinitely by the machinations of central banks. Perhaps, but it seems unlikely that this will be so. In my view, this is not likely to end quietly, but it is difficult to see our way beyond it. If there is to be a third chapter of conservative philanthropy, then it will be drafted out of the upheaval that is as yet in its early stages. And thank you.
So I see my good friend Mark Schmidt just came in. I just wanted to tell you missed the best part, so you can probably just leave now. First of all, if I say anything that doesn't make any sense, it was because I was up half the night with my child. So you can blame him for that. Don't blame me. Also, I think this panel is going to be a little bit like Rashomon, where we're all telling about the same events, and we're going over some of the same things, but our perception of what actually happened and what was important is going to be somewhat different. Oddly enough, given that I'm not a foundation executive, I actually think my talk may be more on foundations as such, whereas Jim's actually was more about conservatism as such. Although I think we're both going to have, again, some of those two elements. So my talk is basically going to say that if you're trying to ask what was conservative philanthropy, and I think we've all decided to restructure the panel on that, that we can think of conservative foundations as really having had three phases. And again, I was trained by Straussians, which I said that once, and then somebody was like, is that like being trained by, raised by wolves? And I was like, no. So my tendency is to think about, periods as being divided into regimes with a kind of, sort of coherent spirit that holds them together. And I think we can think of there having been three eras or regimes of conservative philanthropy, what I'll call the classical era, the era I associate with Volcker, Earhart, to some degree the Liberty Fund. And again, some of these, continue over. There's overlap between these eras. The second being the modern, which I associate with Bradley, Olin, the old Smith Richardson before things got weird in the board. And the third, which I'll call the postmodern era, the era now in which the Philanthropy Roundtable has hundreds of participants, in which it's in some sense hard to actually say that there's any coherent spirit that holds together this very diverse group. So the theme of my talk is really about explaining where the modern era of conservative foundations came from, the foundation that Jim ran so well, the Olin being the classic example of that, what they inherited from their classical predecessors, and how their model might be beginning to fray, which I think was also an element of Jim's presentation. With each of these, I'm going to make 2 points. One about the object or spirit of their philanthropy, and one about their method. And I think each of these eras had a distinct element of both the spirit and the method of philanthropy. So the classical era. This, in my mind, really starts out with Volcker, and this is obviously going to hand over to Lenore. Volcker really is not going very long. That's what's sort of remarkable about it is they have this incredibly important role, and then they kind of hand themselves off, their spirit off like a baton to Earhart, and then die off in a kind of very weird, for reasons that are almost unbelievably weird, and we're not going to get into what happened there. Their spirit really was remnantism, right? The belief that liberty, as they understood it, was in peril, and that the basic argument for free markets was not even understood anymore, and that those who believed it were scattered to the four winds and were not in contact with one another. The object of conservative philanthropy, and this wasn't really a word they probably would have used themselves, was to bring these hardy souls together, to allow them to rebuild the argument for liberty once more, and to make it available to the small coterie of individuals who could gradually diffuse it through society. The inspiration for this was not so much Hayek's Road to Serfdom as it was his essay, The Intellectuals and Socialism, in which he observed that, quote, in every country that has moved towards socialism, the phase of the development in which socialism has become a determining influence on politics has been preceded for many years by a period during which socialist ideas governed the thinking of the more active intellectuals. Experience suggests that once this phase has been reached, it's merely a question of time until the views now held by the intellectuals become the governing force of politics. So the spirit of Volcker and Earhart's philanthropy was that politics was, as the Marxists used to say, superstructural. But instead of being derivative of deep economic forces, it was derivative of the deep intellectual current of belief, what Gramsci would have called the hegemonic ideas of the time. Right? This philosophy was essentially Fabian. If you change the fundamental beliefs of those operating in the political sphere, politics would change with it, right? But you couldn't change politics if you hadn't changed people's fundamental operating assumptions. And conversely, the assumption that was that without such a change, political activity was essentially wasted. The universities were consequently a central focus of Volcker and Earhart's work, as well as a small set of independent intellectuals, since that's where the ideas that filtered down to politicians came from. So that's the spirit of this classical era. Now, the method, which again I actually happen to be more interested in, it actually is our good luck that the men who created this model of philanthropy left us a document until recently moldering away in the archives and found by my colleague Angus Bergen and Hopkins that stated exactly what they thought they were doing. And this is unusual that people do this, but in 1956, the president of Volcker wrote a detailed report called, uncreatively, A Review and Recommendations. Again, some things never change in philanthropy, in which he detailed the various components of the Volcker model. And again, the thing that strikes me is how much of this stuck, right? And again, I've talked to Kim Dennis about this. And just the highlights of this document where they said what they were doing were, first of all, anonymous philanthropy. So this didn't carry over as much. But it says resources should not be used in any way to perpetuate the Volcker name. Now, I think in part, right, I mean, Olin named a lot of stuff, right? But I don't think that was the key inspiration of that foundation. It wasn't simply to keep the name of the donor going. Second, and interestingly, they said the second component was what they called venture philanthropy, which was not what it has come to be known as, which they say risk-taking, which involves the endurance of many disappointments as the price of high achievement. Third, they said patient philanthropy. Quote, the recognition that the most important human problems require long-term rather than short-term treatment. We can never have the advantage of operating with positive indications of success. This metrics people should take note. A full generation is the minimum germination period for a new idea. Fourth, what they called aggressive philanthropy, not sitting back and waiting for proposals, but actively seeking out people and ideas. Next, a kind of anti-planning spirit. And this is one of the most interesting lines I found. Again, one of the things that's most strikingly different than modern strategic philanthropy. They said, quote, we do not feel that this method is appropriate to creative endeavor, what they call the Ford method of figuring out a huge strategy and then going out and basically creating contractors out of organizations to do all of the different aspects. Again, quoting, it is possible to determine in advance the areas in which the need for creative scholarship seems to be most urgent, but one cannot buy genius by the pound. Having isolated areas where further work is necessary, our only function is to search for persons whose own minds and consciences have already moved them to work in this direction, but whose work can be made easier by lightening the burdens of financial responsibilities. And finally, what they called ideological philanthropy, an emphasis on basic ideas and values rather than on mere metrics, mere mechanics and techniques. And finally, the thing I would add is small staff, right? What they actually went out of their way in this document to say they had a small staff and they wanted it that way, right? That actually there would be no advantage of getting any larger. Okay, so that's the spirit and the method. The modern period. Now I'm kind of going over Jim's biography, but what generally strikes me in digging around on this is just how much this very small group of foundations of Volcker and Earhart passed along to their successors. Volcker passed its model on to Earhart, and then what became the Olin Foundation, just as it was being set up, they went to Earhart, Frank O'Connell went to Earhart and got advice from Earhart on how to do this kind of work, right? Mike Joyce then took this model, again with some adaptations to Bradley, and in essence it became the orthodox model of what conservative philanthropy is supposed to look like, right? To some degree, there was an isomorphic force, right? This group of conservative foundations had said, this is what conservative philanthropy is supposed to look like, and conservative foundations therefore had to have some very strong reason not to behave in this way, right? So again, there were changes which I'll describe briefly, but especially at the level of method, what strikes me is the remarkable continuity from the classical to the modern period. First, the spirit. I think this is where there really is a difference, and I think Jim is right on this. The spirit of the first wave of foundations was libertarian and remnantist, right? They thought they were the few ones down in the catacombs, right? And there was still some of that in the second wave, but what was distinctive was what I'll characterize, and Jim did too, as the neoconservative spirit, and its greater optimism about the potential for change, which somewhat reduced, but only somewhat, its time horizon, right? So neoconservatism, at least as applied to these questions, added a very distinct spirit to the work of conservative philanthropy. I would characterize the distinction as one of coming up out of the catacombs and engaging directly with modern liberalism. In particular, I think what is most distinct was neoconservatives' characteristic move, which was to accept liberalism's objectives and to some degree its objects of concern, but to argue that conservative and libertarianish methods were a much better way of achieving them. School choice, welfare reform, enterprise zones, markets rather than regulation for dealing with externalities, an individual mandate for health care. Yes, I think that was actually a conservative idea. I think history bears this out. These were all classically neoconservative positions, right? And Olin, Bradley, and their compatriots were essential in injecting this spirit into conservatism. On the one hand, attacking liberalism for no longer adequately serving those who they said were the object of its compassion, and then arguing that conservatism couldn't beat something with nothing, and that was a very neoconservative move, which their predecessors wouldn't have, right? Their predecessors would not have said, oh, we need to have our own answer to whatever it was, right? They insisted that the critical role of conservative activism and philanthropy was to both show that liberalism wasn't working on its own terms and that conservative solutions could achieve liberal objectives better than liberals could. Methods, right? While there was a real difference with the classical era in spirit, as well as a great deal of similarity, I think there was a lot of overlap on method. The modern conservative foundations, like Olin, kept a very small staff. They assumed that they would often have to keep ideas going for a long and even indeterminate time before they were ready for prime time. They kept a close relationship with their grantees and depended on inside information as to how they were doing rather than formal information such as metrics, which they used almost not at all. I think there was some point where I interviewed Jim and I asked about how he did evaluation, and he sort of made it pretend like he was doing a phone call. So while not abandoning the long term, they spread their bets temporally a bit more than in the classical period, creating more of a pipeline all the way from fundamental ideas of the kind that the classical period did, all the way to those who diffused them in magazines and everything else. The other thing I would say is there are more things to fund by this point. And one big difference, I think, between the modern period and the classical period is the modern period focused more on giving general operating support to organizations that were already ongoing concerns and then letting them manage their own affairs, rather than in the period before there really were these organizations where they had to fund intellectuals directly. Right? One other point on this, while the founders' intent was important for all these foundations, my sense it was also not slavishly observed. The men who ran these foundations realized that not all the answers to what could be done could come from the donor or his choices for the board. I would characterize this in the way that Jack Balkin has characterized constitutional theory as living originalism. All right, these foundations, had a very powerful ideological spirit from their original donor, but they realized the staff had to make these decisions on their own. They couldn't just go back to the original documents. They weren't fundamentalists in this sense, right? Finally, and this is we get to the point where both Jim and I are sort of seeing through a glass darkly on what I'll call postmodernity, postmodern conservative philanthropy. I'll discuss this only briefly, both for reasons of time and because it's still a process very much in motion. But the reason to think that conservative philanthropy, and with it conservative activism in general, may be diverging from the very successful model of the modern period in both spirit and method. Spirit, again, neoconservatism was about beating the liberals at their own game, showing that they could attain liberal ends better than liberals could. I think this spirit may be dwindling, and I refer to that a little bit in my essay in National Affairs on the eternal return of compassionate conservatism, a word that I know gives Lenore hives, and we may actually have to get some medical assistance for her. So there's far less interest than there once was in the spirit of conservative problem solving that was characteristic of people like my good friend Larry Mead. I think of as almost the perfect example of that kind of spirit, right? Conservatives have entered into a period in which they are somewhat less optimistic about and morally obligated to claim that they can better vindicate liberal ends. Some of this is a result of pessimism that large numbers of minorities can ever be brought over to the conservative cause, and some of it comes from the more full-throated belief in liberty and budgetary austerity that's taken over the movement. Some of it also comes from the sense that conservatives no longer have to play the long game. Hayek and those who learned from him believed that they were in a multi-generational battle, but conservatives have come to believe that the battle of Armageddon is upon us, that they've caught the liberals in their crosshairs. Now I'm mixing a metaphor, but and now is the time they no longer have to engage in fancy feinting and tacking maneuvers of the kind that neoconservatives did, but can actually destroy liberalism. I think this explains why many conservative donors have lost interest in the larger, longer battle of ideas and are putting more of their money, as the Kochs have, in hardball political organizing. And this finally gets us to method. Conservatives generally eschewed foundation professionalism in the modern period. In fact, they created their own organization, the Philanthropy Roundtable, as an alternative to philanthropic professionalism, because they were worried that foundations would lose their distinctive character if they were drawn into facing all the other foundations in their world. That distinction is also starting to wane. Metrics, measurement, logic models, and the rest of the apparatus of new philanthropy are becoming as popular among the conservative philanthropists who go to Philanthropy Roundtable meetings as they are to mainstream and liberal foundations. In the end, this will have major consequences for the organizations they fund, and I think they will not be positive. As a liberal, I'm somewhat glad for this. But as an admirer of the style of philanthropy first pioneered by the Volcker Fund, I have to admit that my pleasure in this is at best bittersweet.
Well, that's terrific. I think I'm the historian of the bunch, but I have very little historical nitpicking to do with these gentlemen's papers, maybe some minor points. Actually, the Realm Earhart, that Realm was in 1926, I think, right, Kim? Which, not the historian, but so something to check out there, because I think Lauren Red Miller is a very interesting story that needs to be told in your history there. So we'll get to that. I think I love the way, Jim, that you've revised the paper, because I think it will just tease up my perfect remarks here to come back and make a defense that classical liberal tradition within philanthropy is really what we need to move forward. So I think, to go forward, we really have to go back and then come forward. So I'm pleased to hear that the failure has been perhaps redeemed by the long-term strategy. So my comments will pick up from that remark there, why we need essentially then a Hayekian revival of principled pluralism to have a genuine conservative philanthropy. So I'll segue there. Bill asked us here today to think about the role of conservative philanthropy in America, with special attention to considering whether it is, as modern liberals believe, a sinister presence bathed in false consciousness, or whether it is a sincere political philosophy based on, as Jim has put it in the original essay, a lively engagement with a coherent body of ideas. In discussing, telling some folks, I live in flyover country right now, I live in Indiana, and in discussing this topic with a few people before I came out, it was impressed upon me that conservative philanthropy means something different in the Midwest than it really does out here on the East Coast. So I want to say that most of what I'm going to be talking about is conservative movement philanthropy, because we need to pay attention. I'm going to give a quick stab at the broad definition of conservative philanthropy, which I think conservative movement philanthropy is a subset of. And I would say that conservative philanthropy, broadly construed, is that philanthropy that seeks to understand, restate, and amplify the philosophic foundations of a free society, and to ground social institutions, including traditional charitable ones, on those principles. So I think conservative movement philanthropy, about which we're mostly talking here, is about the ideas themselves, not necessarily those charitable institutions. In any event, these questions invite us to reflect on both the genesis of the modern conservative movement and its future, and to reflect, as I think Jim's paper helps us to do, on the roots, contexts, and prospects for the renewal of conservative movement philanthropy. Now, the question of renewal is especially important because, as both of our speakers have observed, and Bill has in other writings elsewhere, one success of the conservative movement philanthropy has been its diversification over the years. The indispensable visionaries, Volcker, Olin, and Earhart, are long or soon to be gone, and while stalwarts such as Bradley, Scaife, Koch, and many others are still with us, they are unable to fund from their coffers alone the annual budgetary requirements of an expansive institutional network of conservative think tanks, publications, academic centers, and similar initiatives that have grown up in the last 30 years or so. As the founder of a relatively new think tank, I can testify to how difficult it is to attract funding today in this domain. And I lament the passing of the good old days that Bill's described, when a few phone calls were maybe all it took to turn on some funding. So the phone call philanthropy, right? But I think also, as Jim and Steve both suggest, the future of conservative philanthropy will increasingly depend upon a larger but more decentralized network of donors. And many of these donors are already learning to invoke the blessing of the conservative idol of donor intent. And I'll come back to that point in just a moment. The future of conservative philanthropy is also being shaped by non-conservative forces. Conservative donors have not been immune to pressures of professionalization. I would not be shocked, and Steve echoes the point here, that some conservative donors may even imitate their progressive counterparts with grant management systems in which values clarification, theories of social change, and process models are used. The growing likelihood of regulatory scrutiny has accelerated this trend, requiring all nonprofit entities to create more detailed paper trails. Last and definitely not least, conservative philanthropy has been seduced by what Thomas Bertineau recently described in Academic Questions with wonderful conservative aplomb as, I'm going to quote, the global apocalypse of total politicization and the outlawing of judgment. It's on this latter problem that I want to concentrate the remainder of my remarks, and I have two critical points to make. First of all, conservatism is not a coherent body of ideas. And secondly, despite its belief in its rectitude, conservative movement philanthropy has neither adequately defined nor necessarily improved American philanthropy as a whole. Let me take up the first point. Jim's given us a quite helpful sketch of the phase shifts of the conservative movement since its emergence after World War II. I want to add just a few nuances and caveats to this storyline. The conservative movement is composed of a network of diverse people who found common cause primarily in their opposition to collectivism in general and their interest in communist containment and eradication in particular. Many participants in the early movement indeed rallied around the iconography of Hayek's Road to Serfdom, but it is a stretch to suggest that what came to be called conservatism in America coalesced into a coherent body of ideas. It was, in fact, the potential incoherence, or at least the deep tensions that ran among the various strains of conservative thought that led Frank Meyer to set forth an argument for fusionism in an essay in National Review published almost 50 years ago today, September 25th, 1962. Fusionism, most simply, tried to build a philosophical bridge between the partisans of virtue, the traditionalists, and the partisans of freedom, the libertarians. But it was a bridge that was constantly under raid by the parties it sought to unite. Not the least of these raids, Jim's mentioned in his paper, was, and this happened before the bridge was even passable, was one launched by Hayek himself with his essay, Why I Am Not a Conservative, delivered at a Mont Pelerin Society meeting in 1957 and then published as the postscript to his book, The Constitution of Liberty, in 1960. The conservative movement was, from the outset, less a coherent set of ideas than a conversation that managed somehow to enact in microcosm the ideal of a classical liberal society. Conservatives never cohered. They rather oscillated around a core commitment to the liberal idea of civility that enabled people with different moral and philosophical values to work together towards sustaining America's distinctive market constitutional order. We might imagine, the best image I could think of was a caduceus, so with the snakes twining. We might imagine a living caduceus, which became even more twisted when neoconservatives joined the conversation in earnest. I've tried to represent the outright cacophony this conversation could be at times in the chart on the handout I provided, and it's a real mess, but it's deliberately a real mess. I took Hayek's essay and tried to plot out his position on conservatism, and maybe you can get one for these gentlemen, but you have to read it like this, okay?
Like a logic model.
No, it's an illogic model, actually. It's basically to point out what a mess it is, and you can't plot this stuff in any kind of linear fashion. The incorporation of neoconservative thought into the conservative movement, as Jim suggests in his original paper, was a key factor in the Reagan Revolution. This was the moment at which conservatism transformed from primarily a conversation about political philosophy, American history, and the culture of liberty to what Jim calls a governing philosophy. This brings me to my second point. Conservative philanthropy has, in the end, neither adequately defined nor made American philanthropy as a whole better. After Reagan, many conservatives who had tasted the fruits of political success and found that they were sweet could not, like Cincinnatus or George Washington, retire from public power, each to tend again his own vine and fig. By 1990, America was in the throes of a full-blown culture war, and there was plenty of work to do. But this culture war has not ceased. And alongside it, American politics, as Jim just commented, I think, has become less and less a realm of civil discourse and responsible rhetoric, and more a battleground over civil rights and public benefits. There is still much work to do, but can the conservative movement on its current trajectory do this work well? The question I believe conservatives must answer is whether philanthropy is the pursuit of the public good, and thus ancillary to politics itself, or whether philanthropy is the beneficent expression of our love for what it means to be human, and thus a decisively apolitical or pre-political social domain of human action. What is the role of philanthropy in a free society? It is a question conservatives answer by mumbling about donor intent, civil society, and the iniquity of the Ford Foundation. We cannot answer this question at a deeper level than such sound bites because we have failed to take a radical look at the nature of philanthropy and its institutions in order to understand its promise and its perils. Having the courage to examine more closely the relationship between philanthropy and freedom will likely require a renewal of the classical liberal strain of conservative thought. With Hayek, and indeed with the American founders, classical liberals hold that it is less important who governs than what government is allowed to do. The federal government in Washington was designed to exercise only a small number of delegated powers. Though it is often difficult to recall what this means, living in the shadow of overlordship Washington now cast, until the Tea Party's recent entrance, stage right, the classical liberal star had been slowly eclipsed by conservatism's new governing class. Unfortunately, this new governing class seemed all too willing to adopt means of influence pioneered by their progressive liberal counterparts, including turning their philanthropy to ever more political ends. Even classical liberal donors, such as the Kochs Steve's mentioned, have not been immune from the temptations of politicized philanthropy. We wonder where the ghost of Buckley is when we need him to stand athwart the 501c4s and yell, "Stop!" Jim tells us in his paper that advocacy philanthropy was actually invented by the left in the 1960s, especially in the vision of McGeorge Bundy of the Ford Foundation, who sought leverage for liberal ideas over the administrative and regulatory state. This was merely, however, the addition of a new play into what had been the progressive game plan since the era of Woodrow Wilson. In response, conservative movement philanthropy, which had intentionally been primarily a funder of research and ideas, and I know Steve sketches that out very nicely, did not shy away from developing its own methods of advancing its influence on government. Thus were born the think tanks that have drawn the envy of American liberalism, but may have also deflected conservatives from continuing to build a philosophy of freedom and to hone the arts of rhetoric and cultural persuasion. Compassionate conservatism, I said it, was clearly a phrase born of seeming desperation to boost conservatism's reputation as a governing philosophy. Today's bleeding heart libertarians seem to be engaged in a similar sort of plea for respectability, at least among the liberal scholars who whisper into the ears of Washington bureaucrats, foundation program officers, and university administrators. The things swallowed up by this cancer of the politics of governance, however, were often the very things that made American democracy work: a regard for human dignity that did not manifest in a utopian quest for social justice, a respect for accomplishment without envy, a conviction that power is never safe, but it is safer when it is dispersed throughout society rather than concentrated in anyone's hands, and a daily cultivation of habits of both civil association and economic cooperation by which Americans simply got things done without much resort to political power. In the end, though we talk much about the need for civil society and philanthropy, conservatives have not succeeded in convincing the nonprofit sector that its role is not to be merely the implementing arm of welfare state policy, or even the social entrepreneurs of new public-private partnerships. In casting civil society as a sphere of mediating structures that shield the individual from the weight of state power, modern conservatism has largely failed to rely upon and strengthen civil society as a viable route to self-governance by means other than politics. Conservatism needs very much to play a role in politics, but one focused on consistently reminding politicians and regulators and ourselves what the state is not allowed to do. But conservative philanthropy must not neglect its higher calling, which should be to help philanthropic and civic associations take up their roles as constituting structures and the very workshops of freedom. So, what should conservative philanthropy look like in the future? If the promise that a free society might spring forth across Columbia from sea to shining sea is to be realized, conservative philanthropy will have to renew its philosophical roots and more. Conservatism will need to reclaim the reputation of individualists, who are not primarily atomistic anarchists, but persons who, having come to know their own minds, are yet guided in their actions by a balance of epistemological humility and conscientious judgment. As Frank Meyer argued, the person is the locus of virtue. Frank Meyer also said, "A social order is a good social order to the degree that men live as free persons under conditions in which virtue can be freely realized, advanced, and perpetuated." So we need not proclaim ourselves people of compassion or bleeding hearts, but must simply demonstrate our desire and capability of associating with and even helping others when such cooperation is a voluntary arrangement where the moral rules of reciprocity are operational. Living within and by the principles of a free society should be our first act of philanthropy. Helping others do the same should be our second. Conservatism also needs to rethink the claims of politics. Here we might look to the words of British philosopher Michael Oakeshott, who reminded us that we must avoid, especially in times of political crisis, the temptation to believe in the overwhelmingly superior importance of political activity. I have a few lines of Oakeshott I'd like to quote. "The work of protection is never of primary importance, and when in times of political crisis it appears to be so, that is merely because in the absence or poverty of creative activity, protection has usurped the place of recreation. On occasion, a society may be preserved and may survive by means of political action, but to make it live requires a social activity of a different and more radical character, and its life is as often threatened by political success as by political failure." End quote. Finally, conservative donors will have to decide whether the ultimate end of philanthropy is to use our property to make people over in our own image, or to require people to toe the line of the donor's intent, or whether philanthropy and civil society comprise a sphere of human action where we freely devote the best of ourselves to helping other people help themselves. Through our philanthropy, we should be free to express our own substantive values. We should also be open, like the Good Samaritan, to allowing our philanthropy to take us out of ourselves into a sphere of disinterested identification with people who may be very strange to us. Like our actions in the marketplace, good philanthropy calls us both to know ourselves and to engage fairly with others. And it is through our successful interactions in civil society that we each grow in our capacities as free and responsible individuals. So, with the winds of statism still blowing strongly around us, a new generation must take up seriously Tocqueville's challenge to Americans to understand and enact the science of human association, or drift farther down the road to soft despotism. So what we really need is a principled pragmatism of a sort. Conservative philanthropy will be both most conservative and most philanthropic, not when it is a governing philosophy in search of a government, but when it is again a living and friendly persuasion of the heart, the mind, and the hands that embraces in full what it means to be human. Thank you.
Well, I'm a little dazzled by what's come before me today. Although I hang my hat at an academic institution, I'm not really a scholar, historian, economist, political scientist, whatever. I feel a little bit at this point in the program like my favorite Peanuts cartoon, where Linus and Lucy and Charlie Brown are lying on a hillside looking at the clouds. And someone says, "What do you see in the clouds?" And I don't know, Linus says, "I see the Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel painting." And Lucy says, "I see the stoning of St. Stephen by such." And then Charlie Brown says, "I was going to say I saw a ducky and a horsey, but I changed my mind." So on that note, let me say that we didn't until we met in the green room coming before here really kind of trade notes about what we were going to say. And I think we're in a position of people wearing the same dress to the wedding, you know, and finding that out at the last minute before it's too difficult to change. I actually, although I think my assigned role here, as you know, indicated by Bill, is to be the kind of left flank as somebody who's spent a good part of the last 15 or 20 years in whatever passes for progressive philanthropy or social justice philanthropy. But I actually would associate myself with a lot of what's been said and had largely the same critique. And so I'm going to take about 10 minutes saying it in a different way. And maybe I'll make a couple of different points. When I came here, I got an email the other day from a colleague who was in the room actually saying, "Gonna go see you at the Hudson Institute, you know, kick ass with a right-wing foundation." And I said, in all honesty, no, actually that's not what I'm going to do, because I know Jim Piereson a long time, and I'm a big admirer. We don't agree on much in the political realm. And I'd say the same thing about Bill Schambra, who I've also had a long association with. We don't agree in the political realm, but we agree very much on the kind of craft of philanthropy and the critique of philanthropy as it's often practiced. I came into philanthropy in the middle 1990s to establish for George Soros a U.S. program, which I led for about 11 years before I went to Atlantic Philanthropies for the next 5 or so. And around the time I came into philanthropy, there was a lot of soul-searching about so-called progressive philanthropy. You know, the golden era, which is not viewed as the golden era by some people, but the golden era, you know, McGeorge Bundy and what Carnegie and Rockefeller and all that were doing in the 60s and so on was long past. There was a sense that progressive philanthropy was really out of steam. You had the report from the National Committee on Responsive Philanthropy that Sally Covington, I think it was, did, which, while it, I think, and I'll get back to this in a minute, it was properly criticized on some grounds, kind of crystallized for a lot of progressives the idea that the conservative foundations were kind of eating their lunch and that were setting the terms of the debate in a way that progressive foundations weren't doing. And so looking to Olin and looking to Bradley and looking to Scaife to some extent, there was a challenge that was really laid down. There's a lot of discussion in progressive philanthropy about that, and as some have indicated, Some people tried to rise to the challenge. We can talk a little bit about that with the Democracy Alliance and so on. But it certainly influenced a lot of what I thought about doing at the Open Society Institute. And having said that, I agree with Jim, and I want to underscore that I think the critique of conservative philanthropy as nefarious, evil empire, all that kind of stuff, has always been overblown. It is true that the combined assets and spending of the most prominent organized, conservative philanthropies was always dwarfed by whatever you might consider to be their progressive counterparts. Another way of looking at that is that they got a much better bang for their buck than progressives had. They used their money better, and I think the investment in ideas, for instance, was a very good use of the money and very strategic use of the money. I guess I'm now addressing myself to what I'm most familiar with, which is what you call the modern era of conservative philanthropy. Conservative philanthropy has never been as monolithic as people on my side like to make it out to be, or as a conspiracy. I totally concur with that. But what it has been, or at least in its golden period, I think has been very effective at setting the terms of the debate and generating new debate and new policies on some of the areas that have been mentioned, whether it's welfare reform or criminal justice policy or the school voucher movement, the charter school movement, and so on. So I accept that Jim's point about the hyperbolic nature of the kind of left's critique of conservative philanthropy when it was in its heyday. I want to go beyond that and say that one of the reasons I feel and have always felt kind of an affinity for a lot of Jim's thinking and Bill Chambra's thinking is that at its best, I think, when you talk about I think Stephen made a distinction between the object and the method. When you talk about the method of conservative philanthropy, I've always felt there was a great deal to be learned from it, and in the following way. Conservative philanthropies, at their best, have tended to identify people doing good work and support them with general support, with multi-year support, without a lot of the kind of hoo-ha about metrics and that characterizes most other kinds of philanthropies. This is changing, as has been noted, and I want to talk about that. So I've had a lot to learn from that. I've always thought it was very funny. I'll put it in a more humorous way, or try to anyway. I come out of progressive philanthropy, and I've observed conservative philanthropy very closely. Years ago, I was in a debate with Mike Joyce at the Philanthropy Roundtable about all this stuff, and people seem to appreciate this following kind of comparison. That movie Freaky Friday, the Disney movie where the mother and the daughter inhabit each other for a day. I think in the philanthropic realm, liberal and conservative foundations kind of trade places in their approach to philanthropy. So if you look at liberal, they are supposed to believe in, or if you look at conservative, they're all about people should pull themselves up by the bootstraps, and there should be welfare cutoffs. There should be, individualism rules the day, and very tough love kind of approach that conservatives would tend to take in the social sphere if you're talking about criminal justice system, education. Well, in the philanthropic sphere, they kind of trade places with liberals. They believe in, permanent entitlement, as it were. And there are no rigorous requirements or metrics or anything like that. They're really very happy to write a check and to let people do as they wish. I'm overstating it slightly. Liberals, on the other hand, in the larger society, believe differently about the way you treat what social policy should be. But in their philanthropic practices, they ape the worst of what they think are conservative social policies. You get cut off with 3 years, no chance of renewal, all that kind of stuff. So there's a kind of a trading places thing. And as I've tried to do philanthropy when I've had the opportunity to do it, and not always successfully, because there's a lot you're fighting against in terms of the culture of philanthropy, I think that the best philanthropies of all kinds have the kind of approach to the work that has been described a little bit earlier here. That is, you identify good people doing good work. It's not that you don't hold them accountable in a sense, but you fund them because you think they're advancing the kinds of change you want to see in the world, and you give them the room to do that. And part of the room to do that means the kind of patient investment that was referred to earlier. So I think it's the case, Jim would be, I've heard him talk about it, that if you look at the portfolio of the Olin Foundation over a number of years, you would see you wouldn't see a huge amount of change from year to year in the body of people who are being supported. I just looked last night because I'm a little rusty about contemporary conservative philanthropy at the Bradley Foundation's website, and I think I saw the same kind of thing, which is you identify people that are your partners in a shared kind of vision of the way things should go, and you support them over a period of years to do so. That has not been the practice of most progressive foundations, and we could learn a lot from the conservative foundations. Also, the risk-taking, at least at its best, the early work on, school vouchers in Wisconsin by the Bradley Foundation or things like that, were up against a considerable tide at a moment when, and I hate school, I'm not saying this as an admirer of the policy, but I'm saying it as kind of admirer of an approach to philanthropy and social change. These early battles were taken on when the prevailing winds were very much contrary. And you had to have an appetite for risk to take a long-term view of what might happen. So I wanted to make that nod to conservative philanthropy. I also want to say that I very much agree that at its best, conservative philanthropy, and it's interesting how we're talking in the past tense here, and we'll get to that, has been fundamentally about ideas. So you think of institutions in which investments were made, the Manhattan Institute in New York, and the way the Manhattan Institute, through a series of lunchtime forums like this, gathering people, and not only, just like at Hudson or Bradley Center, not only like-minded people, but people who might challenge and push, laid the groundwork for a lot of the ideas that animated the early years of the Giuliani administration in New York. The Heritage Foundation and its influence on the Reagan agenda has been often noted. The Federalist Society and the way it helped reshape, a notion of what the judiciary and what the courts should do, what lawyers should do, very, very effective. Such to the point that in my own philanthropic career, and Mark Schmidt, who was my colleague at Open Society when I was there, will recall this, we did our best to create institutions to respond to that, like the American Constitution Society, because the intellectual ground had been ceded to the right. It's still the case, I would say, having spent 15 or 20 years on the progressive side of philanthropy, that by and large, there's a lot more discussion of ideas and philosophy in reference to philosophy, of which there have been, I should have kept, we could have made a drinking game out of the invocation of Hayek and so on here today. But I've heard philosophers invoke more in any given lunch at the Hudson Institute than in any council on foundations meeting that I've ever been to, or any internal discussion of anybody, with the exception actually of my former employer George Soros, who I know is a bête noire to many people on the right, but who actually is a person of ideas and cares a lot of ideas and cares a lot about changing the discourse. And also, when I heard earlier when Lenore was saying that it was less about coherence of ideas than about a conversation, if I heard you correctly. It reminded me of the way Soros thought about things. I mean, again, this is not his image, partly because, and I want to return to this for a second, he, at a certain point, decided that politics was more attractive than philanthropy. So like the Koch brothers, he kind of went in that direction. I don't think he's ever quite recovered from it. But George, at his best, was his foundation, the Open Society Institute, which is it's premised on the thinking of Karl Popper, who was very influential to him, captures G.K. Chesterton's quote about Buddhism, not a creed but a doubt. It was all about the doubt, and so there's a lot more discussion of philosophy, or has been on the right, than there has been on the on the left over many years. So up to now, I don't think I've said very much different than any of my fellow panelists. I do want to conclude with a couple of other thoughts. I was going to say, before people who have more standing to say it than I said it, that I think that conservative philanthropy is not in its finest moment. I think it has run out of steam a bit for a variety. Part of that is because, as a few people have noted, I think it has succumbed increasingly to the siren song of, practical efforts and metrics and all that. And I don't mean to, people who know my views on this, which are a little more nuanced than I'm indicating right now, know that I've been a critic on the, mainstream philanthropy of the over-reliance on metrics and the over-reliance on a what works approach to philanthropy. I think the problem with the what works approach to philanthropy is that very often it doesn't have anything at its core. It doesn't really have any set of beliefs or ideology at its core. And ideology can be carried too far, but it's useful to know how do you think about the world and how do you approach the world. And while people say there's no liberal or conservative way to pick up the garbage and all that kind of stuff, the fact is ideology matters, or philosophy matters. And I think philanthropy across the spectrum has largely gotten away from that. And the pragmatic problem-solving approach to philanthropy, which is taken over a lot of the more centrist or progressive foundations, I see a lot when I go to the Philanthropy Roundtable, which I'm an admirer. I always got a lot more out of Philanthropy Roundtable meetings than most other philanthropic gatherings, partly because they were open to contrary points of view and having people like me there, and partly because, in fact, they often address themselves to the practical challenges of philanthropy. But I think there's a cost to that, and I think you're seeing it in the life cycle of conservative philanthropy right now. I also think that, quite apart from the increasing move in that direction, that, if this provoked a vigorous counter response, I'd be happy to have it. I don't see very much on the ideas front coming out of conservative philanthropy at the moment anymore. Right? I think that we're kind of coasting off the fumes of the ideas of 20 or 25 years ago. In conservative philanthropy. I think that part of that problem is that to the extent that conservative thinking and conservative philanthropy has become fused with conservative government, such as we've had, there's a fair amount of buyer's remorse about foreign policy and about economic policy. I think that I don't think conservative philanthropy has very much to say, frankly, about the changing demographics of the country. I don't think they have good answers to that. There's a lot of kind of snide critique of identity politics and affirmative action and all that. But it is not a very racially diverse movement. I looked at the board of the Bradley Institute when I happened to go on their website. And while there's an African-American man on it, he's one of 8 or 10 men who are older than I am, which is to say, getting up there. Yeah. I don't think both in the sense of who's participating. Obviously, the kind of arguments that conservative philanthropy has had to make to the left about, claiming that conservatives can act in do a better job of acting in the interests of minorities and women than the left, have, whatever you think of them on their merits, haven't really made much traction in attracting, in my view, people of color to that movement. I think that's a dangerous sign for conservative movement, conservative philanthropy, as well as for conservative politics. So I think that too much move in a pragmatic direction to the detriment of what made conservative philanthropy most effective, which was a focus on ideas in the longer term, and in a bit of a intellectual impoverishment in its current manifestation. I'll end there, I think, except to say that a couple of things. We could have a discussion. I wasn't invited to the social justice philanthropy discussion, so I could have said this in that context and have my own kind of Sister Souljah moment. But But I think that I'm not sure that the other side of the spectrum is any better off, but that's a different conversation, not the one that we came to have here today. And one of the things that I most appreciate about Bradley Center in general, but also about particularly Lenore's and Jim's comments today, is that there is a candor and a self-criticism that I don't see too often in philanthropy on the whole, and I don't see that often on my side of the spectrum, that is both refreshing, but also the only way that only having an honest conversation and taking a step back from your and looking at what you're doing with some candor and some honesty is the only way, obviously, to get to a better place. So thank you for inviting me.
Well, thanks very much. Before we get to the Q&A, there's a surprising sort of consistency of sentiment here, I think, and that is that conservative philanthropy has retreated from the realm of ideas and has become increasingly engaged in the world of politics itself, the practicalities of politics, and we can all point to various conservative funders who have engaged in that sort of movement and champion that sort of movement among conservatives. Gara seems to suggest that conservatism is intellectually exhausted sort of independently of the lure of politics. Others, Lenore, I think, to some degree, Steve, perhaps, you tend to think that it's not so much the push of intellectual exhaustion as it is the draw of governing, the draw of politics, of political engagement. Does anybody have any thoughts about, what is to say about that? I mean, are there conservative ideas? If a donor were today, say, to listen to you guys and say, gee, you're right, we need to focus less on, surreptitious funding of C4 activity, which we all know is going on, and we need to fund more on intellectual engagement. Are there ideas? Is there a set of ideas out there waiting for development? Lenore, you sort of sketched out one, and but it's such and it was a terrific presentation of a very difficult and subtle point. But maybe you can.
Thank you. Well, I think conservatism has rested on its laurels a bit, and I don't think that there's a paucity of ideas. I think there's an abundance of ideas. But you have to continually renew ideas, and a big focus of, I think, conservative philanthropy in the last 20, 25 years has been academic institutional reform. And so to a certain extent, that has been about taking a set of ideas and making sure that those ideas are not lost in those institutions, but it's been attentive to centers and where you're educating students in those ideas, so exposure to ideas. But the flip side of that is to also fund, as the early phase, using Jim and Steve's sort of discussion there, is really going back and funding the scholars themselves. So the Volcker Fund philanthropy was very focused, I would say, on people. Yeah. And not so much on, you mentioned at the end of your talk that it was focused on universities and such. And it
people
was,
in universities.
But that's a very specific difference I think we have to push on a little bit, focused on the people. And I've got a paper coming out, it'll be an independent review in December, I think, on this very point about the relationship of the early Volcker, Earhart type of funding to the universities themselves. And that's changed in this more modern phase of philanthropy, I think, which is to say, let's go and try to undertake institutional reform. The early guys would have said, no, we'll compete with them. But they weren't very well funded, so it's hard to start a bunch of new universities when you're not very well funded. But I think that's an important point to make. But I mean, we are riding on the shoulders of giants like Hayek and Friedman. And there are lots of folks, the neoconservative thinkers. I'm not a historical determinist by any means, but I think that there's certain periods of time coming off of World War II and communism and the reaction to the welfare state when there's opportunity for big ideas to emerge because historical contingency calls forth big ideas. So maybe we're at the end of a period where everybody needs to renew some talking and thinking, and I see this with the situation in politics now. Maybe we're on the verge of a period, but we have to support those individuals again, which is why I say we need to come back to the classical liberal framework.
Yeah, I think also part of the, as I characterize it, the foreshortening of time horizons, which is really, I think you can see as a long-term trend, right? I mean, and in part that comes from you can think of the political economy between funders and organizations, right? When you've got a relatively small number of organizations, there's a lot of opportunity for the extraction of rent on the part of the organizations, right? They can do whatever they want, right? Because they can say, you know, there's only 3 of us, right? We're the only game in town, and you might want us to be going and doing hardball, you know, politics or whatever it is, right? But, you know, take it or leave it. We're the only AAI. If you can find another AAI, then you can give them some money and see how that works out for you. But, you know, there's a lot of games in town now, right? If you want to actually get something much sooner, right, it's a lot easier to do that, right? So there may have been people in conservative philanthropy who were uncomfortable with the fact that people were, you know, were doing these much longer term things, but that, you know, that was the nature of the organization. So in some sense, conservatives have been the victim of their own promiscuous organization building, right? Which is now they're in a situation where they're all competing with each other for donors who would like to actually see measurable results. Well, the only way, again, I think as the founders of the Volcker Fund knew, right? The only way to get those measurable results is to foreshorten your time horizon, right? So I think I actually have, in some sense, a much more structural explanation for why you see this gradual trend toward politics. I think it's both that, and I think it's this belief that that there really is this moment when liberalism might be defeated, right? When there's this battle where you'd really squarely get them in their sights and be able to defeat them. That was not something that Hayek era people believed. They had a belief of where they were in history that's very different than I think the people who are funding Americans for Prosperity have.
Yeah. Jim, if you could just, in picking up on this and on this conversation, you wrote just a wonderful piece in the New Criterion. Forgive me, I forget the title of it, but you gestured toward that in the conclusion of your comments, and one would read that piece if one were a conservative donor interested in sort of practical guidance about what one might do. One would read that piece and kind of despair, right? Because we've now conservatives have turned to politics, have lunged for the kill, you know, in Steve's formulation, and we've failed. And both sides are sort of now engaged in this titanic political struggle in a very uncivil way, you know, in a very highly politicized way. We have thrown our institutions wholeheartedly into this struggle. We have transformed the nature of many of these. I was talking to a think tank president a few years ago who wanted to know what he should say to the donor who wanted him to start buying billboards, right? I mean, that's the degree to which we've kind of shifted politics. But Jim, you in that piece in the New Criterion, you seem to suggest that we are that struggle is underway, and we really just don't know what's going to come out of it. And what would a donor do in light of, should a donor do in light of that kind of yawning darkness, just the other side of this irresolvable titanic struggle that we're engaged in, and to which we've committed all of our institutions.
Would you like me to comment?
Yeah.
Well, thanks, Bill. That piece was titled "The Fourth Revolution," and it was appeared in the June issue of the New Criterion magazine. The thesis was basically this: the United States has gone through 3 upheavals in its past, which has basically structured its politics, its political economy, as it were. This was the Jeffersonian Revolution, of 1800, the Lincoln's Revolution of 1860 and the Civil War, and FDR's Revolution of 1932. It's somewhat schematic, that piece. It suggested a few themes through there. These things occur every 60 or 70 years. They are driven forward by what I call a regime party, Jefferson's party, Lincoln's party, FDR's party, that dominate the system and make this revolution happen. They structure the politics of the era. These things exhaust themselves over a period of time, generally a lifetime. And as they come undone, we typically have an upheaval, which I call a surrogate for revolution in the American system. The historians have used that term, so that the Civil War and the New Deal period were periods where all these things were shaken up and reestablished. So I kind of tried to suggest there that with the financial crisis and so on, that New Deal's World War II structure, the post-war structure, is exhausting itself. The main reason is that because the country has made all sorts of public promises that it can never afford to pay for. And when that reality dawns on people, there will be a kind of upheaval to restructure the system. And I said, this thing seems to be headed toward some kind of a point of crisis. I couldn't really see where it would happen or predict the outcome or anything like that, but my suggestion was that this New Deal cycle, post-war cycle I called it, is ending. And I ended the paper with the thought that if there is a third chapter to be written in conservative philanthropy, it might be written on it as this upheaval takes place through which we reshape our government, the political parties, the relations between them, the coalitions become reshaped in that process. It's as Steve said, somewhat through a glass darkly, but that was kind of what I suggested. So is there something that donors can do? That's a harder question because I couldn't see very far into it. If there is any plea, again, it's something of a plea for big ideas that if I'm right, and I may not be, we have been in what might be called a period of normal politics, normal policy making for a period of time, which may not be appropriate to the era that we're entering.
Let's go to the audience for questions. We have 20 minutes for Q&A. So yes, Kim, please, and stop right at me. No, it's yeah. Oh, and if you could, the microphone will arrive, and if you could state your name and your institutional affiliation, that would be terrific.
Kim Dennis with the Searle Freedom Trust, and we don't do any metrics. I was trained by Jim. I do wonder if part of the shifts we're seeing in conservative philanthropy have something to do with the fact that conservatives feel less like they're reacting to liberals right now than to a dominant political environment that's really more progressive and maybe even somewhat radically progressive in some ways. And so, you know, it might explain why the neocons aren't so influential anymore. If, you know, if what they did was sort of try and capture the goals of liberalism, but pursue that in different ways. If it's not liberalism anymore that we're trying to challenge, then maybe that made them less relevant. And I guess it actually leads me to even though we don't do this, to a defense of sort of politicized philanthropy and what maybe what the Kochs are doing and encouraging. And it's that I think there's a sense out there that our basic liberties are being threatened in such a way that the kind of civil society you talk about, Lenore, while it may be a wonderful ideal, we can't even begin to practice that if you can't, have a bake sale without regulators coming in and, telling you what kind of ovens your cupcakes have to be cooked in or something like that. So I think some of this is motivated by a real sense of urgency that we don't have the luxury to think about big ideas because we're too threatened right now. I'm curious what you guys would say.
I mean, it may be that both Gary and I will simply respond by saying, I mean, and again, with all of the goodwill I know you have, I simply don't know what you're talking about. I mean, honestly, I don't recognize. Now, I mean, I think there are really major threats to what I consider to be liberty, but they're coming less out of any organized radical movement. And again, I simply cannot see the Obama presidency that way. I mean, others, your mileage may differ. But the thing I would say is actually, I think if there's a way of crawling up out of this, right, into some new kind of alignment, it may be that that'll come from the whole set of issues in which actually a desire for liberty and a desire for equality actually go together. And there's a non-trivial, I could come up with a pretty non-trivial set of issues like that. I mean, I'm doing work on prison reform, right? We were talking about the Right on Crime Coalition, right? That's actually a huge area, right? When you think of how many people we have under lock and key, the enormous consequences that has for racial inequality, the enormous consequences that has for the growth of the scope and reach of the state, right? That's a big issue, right? When I think about the growth of licensing at the local level, right? Which again sounds like kind of one of those like wonky, but is enormous. You think of the enormous amount of that's going on, the enormous consequences it has for market entry, especially for people without substantial resources, right? I don't think of that as having anything to do with any kind of liberalism. I could look through theory of justice all I want. I'm not going to see an argument for, that extraordinary kind of licensing, right? The difficulty of doing substantial building in cities, right? Which makes it very hard for them to become more dense and all the other things, I mean, there's a huge set of issues like that actually are right at the intersection of egalitarianism and liberalism. And I think those are and libertarianism. I think those are actually issues in which philanthropy can do an enormous work, right? I think philanthropy is usually the least helpful when there's just a big armed struggle, right? And both sides are already armed up, and the philanthropists sort of throw a few bullets in, right? I mean, where they're most useful is where there's flux in which people haven't quite figured out, right, what the actual ideological coloring of an issue is, right? When you think about a lot, charter schools were a great example of that, right? Where there was real ambivalence, right? Now you add up enough of those things and you've got something that's more than just issue-specific activity. It could or maybe not will be the realignment of a political system. But that's something where philanthropists can do an enormous amount of work without just signing up for one team or the other.
Gara, do you know what Kim is talking about?
No, but I don't want to belabor. I don't want to belabor the point. I mean, I do think that. I mean, Stephen had it right. I think. I mean, at least that was my reaction. But I don't. I guess if I had to critique philanthropy generally, I mean, on the question of engagement in politics, I think that, well, let me use Soros again as an example. I'm not in a position to speak for Soros anymore, or ever was, really. But, he came to feel in, what was it, 2004, 2003, 2004, that all the things that he cared about, a kind of a social welfare state and a kind of a foreign policy that was different than the one we were pursuing after 9/11, all of that, he spent hundreds of $millions on his philanthropy, a lot of money. And in fact, he spent less on politics, but he spent a lot on politics. He spent more on politics than the Bradley Foundation spends in a year on everything that it does. And he came to feel that, I think, and I wasn't involved in it because we had a kind of a wall, as we should have in the foundation, that if he could just get rid of Bush, a lot would happen. Right. He would be a better return on investment. And he didn't, although, one could argue that 4 years later, the world came around more to his point of view. And he's not, as you may have read, that involved as far as I can see in politics anymore. Because Soros at his core is actually about critique, about open society, about independence from government. He's more concerned about, for instance, the national security state policies under both Bush and Obama, And I think that, I've been involved in a fair amount of work by both OSF and Atlantic that in a sense was about pushing one team, So we believe, a lot of people in this room don't agree with it, that, the social safety net should also include universal health care. We put a lot of money into trying to help get universal health care. I don't regret that, but when you look at Obama and you look at, and some people love these policies, drone strikes or any number of things Obama, I don't even like the things that most conservatives like about it. The school stuff is what I least like. So it seems to me that the job of a kind of a progressive philanthropy is more valuable in holding to account and challenging, your own side than it is to being a cheerleader for it. And I think the general trend in American life at all levels of everybody dividing up into teams, that's why when Steve and I say, like, I don't know, I'm a moderate fan of Obama, but I don't recognize the Obama that I see in some of these stories. I mean, who's got the, Heritage Foundation's healthcare policy and Bush administration's national security policy. So I just don't get it, and it's only explainable by this notion that you just have to line up. And I see it to some extent in the way the left looked at Romney or anybody else who happens to be in that place. So philanthropy, if it's anything, ought to be a civil society institution that's independent of that. And I think to the extent that on both sides, I'm not usually a big fan of POCs in both their houses, because I think there's a kind of a faux equality that often the news media has. But for these purposes, I think that you guys would be better off, not, being independent of your leaders and pushing them and critiquing them. And we would be better off that way off.
But George Soros
Yeah.
certainly understood what Kim was talking about, because he felt it right in 2004. That's exactly the way he felt. That the damage from the current regime is so grave, would be so grave if 4 more years.
Well, the difference is he was right, but no.
Exactly.
But
Yes.
no, he did. But the thing is that I don't know what Soros thinks about what he did in 2005. I know he doesn't seem to think anymore that political investment is the most enduring, way to make an impact. He does believe, and if you look at his work in Eastern Europe, in civil society organizations that are independent of government. So when somebody says to me, the crisis from Obama is so great that we have to suspend normal civil, I can't go there. I just can't.
Okay. Yeah. Jim.
It's interesting that I think it was who was the fellow who started the free market think tanks? Fisher? Anthony Fisher went to Hayek to ask him how he should proceed to implement and defend his ideas, because he wanted to run for parliament. And Hayek said, don't go into parliament. Go and start a think tank and get the ideas going. So Hayek sympathized with this idea that you're articulating. Now, I do have a sense of what Kim is thinking about, because I generally agree with it. Conservatives have been saying for a long time, and been concerned for a long time about what you might call the politicization of civil society. That would be higher education, politicizing family life, politicizing cultural life. They don't think that they have been responsible for this, but this has been a theme in conservative thought since the 60s or 70s, that the growth of the state has led to the politicization of all these institutions that should be independent of the state. And so they have not, I agree, they have not succeeded very well in halting this tide. To some extent, one might say that there's a kind of an irresistible force of the state, pressing itself forward. You had FDR said that he couldn't imagine that there could be public sector unionism. But today, public sector unions dominate the Democratic Party. And when we look at government, when citizens look at government, they're not looking at public-spirited citizens serving the public interest. They're looking at Democrats, by and large, in most places. So there is a significant consequence to partisanizing government, which by and large, I think, has been accomplished over these past 30 years. And this is the kind of thing that people like the Kochs and what Tim is talking about is a matter of grave concern for the health of our polity and the future of our politics. I certainly share that idea. So this is the kind of concern that's not made up out of whole cloth, but in my opinion, it's something that's very real.
For those of you who don't know, Scott has recently joined the Capital Research Center here. Vice President.
Thank you, Bill. Scott Walter, Capital Research Center. And I actually have a question for Jim, but I can't let something Mr. Tellez said go unresponded to, because Kim is precisely right. There are small churches and small charities all over America. I used to go to one that literally feed the hungry. They give food away, they have meals, and a significant new regulation is that only food that is prepared at that facility, which is professionally inspected by proper government regulatory inspectors, may be served to the poor and hungry. And of course, in a lot of these cases, you have little old ladies who can struggle around their kitchen and make food, but they can't come down there in a big, busy commercial kitchen and prepare it. And so they are literally being disallowed by government regulators from feeding the hungry. Now, and then second, a quick thing is, you know, the religious liberty. I also have a connection to the Beckett Fund for Religious Liberty. The HHS mandates trampling of religious liberty is something it would be very hard to find a precedent for in American history. So I put me on Kim's side on this one. But my real thing is for Jim, and it grows out of Lenore, whose account I would tweak slightly the way she tweaked Jim's. I think you're a little too hard on compassionate conservatism. There are a lot of cheesy political consultants who just liked it as a slogan because, you know, you need a soft conservative or a hard liberal to get elected. But the man who coined it was Marvin Lasky, and he certainly knows, understands, and upholds what the kind of thing you are pushing for. And George W. Bush, for all of his imperfections and the imperfections of his administration, for which I take a tiny part of the blame. You know, they didn't. I'm not saying they carried it out well, but they were serious about it. And then conversely, I think you're a little too easy on the Hayekians, because as Jim points out, the neos brought things like religion, the arts, culture. Those things matter too, and you don't find much of those in von Mises' Human Action or Hayek's Constitution of Liberty. So a synthesis maybe of the two is what's needed. And I wanted to ask Jim to maybe talk a little bit about, you know, you were head of Olin, now you're head of the Simon Foundation. At least from the outside, it would look like Simon Foundation carries forward a little of Olin's work in this kind of intellectual grantees, but on the other hand, it also does a whole lot of the local, practical, helping the needy. And I'd be fascinated to hear, you know, your thoughts on the comparison of the two.
Well, thank you, Scott. Yes, that is true. The Olin Foundation was a foundation of ideas, and the Simon Foundation does a lot of Catholic education, charter schools, scholarships for inner city kids, mentoring programs for kids, that kind of thing. Its mantra is helping people to help themselves. Simon liked that from Andrew Carnegie. It's interesting, Simon was a very flinty and hard-nosed investment guy, but he did set up a family foundation. Olin Foundation was not a family foundation. Typically, you can have a foundation of ideas with a real purpose. It's typically not a family foundation, because we know that families don't agree on these matters. Or you can have a family foundation that does other things. Simon said he wanted to have what he called a feel-good foundation. And if anybody knew Simon, they would see this is it's a grave paradox. But anyway, you're right, Scott. That's what we do, and you know, we try to do that as well as we can. That was the mission he left us with.
Bill, may I respond to Scott?
Sure, yeah.
Scott, I think the problem with the compassionate conservatism thing, is I'm not going to let it go, is that the very use of partisan politics to defend what are natural human virtues at that level. Why do we look to Papa Bush or Papa Obama? When America looks to Washington to learn how to be compassionate, we've already forgotten what it means to be Americans. That's my problem with needing a phrase like compassionate conservatism as something to get your party some respectability. We've already forgotten how to associate. If you go back and look at your Tocqueville, he says when he comes to America, people associated, that very famous line that everybody quotes about, they just got together and did stuff. And he says, in France, that would have never happened. They looked to the administrators to figure out how to solve the problems. And I think that's the inversion that we're seeing. We look to Washington. We send all our money to Washington, and we look to Washington. And that's Woodrow Wilson's game plan. Let's create a state, an administrative state around. And I think progressive politics, liberal politics, are just as hostage to the regulatory state, the administrative state. They may have more partisans in those positions because, as I was trying to argue, conservatives have a philosophy of self-governance, not a philosophy of how to govern others. So that's my problem.
We need a question from somebody from the NCRP, the National Committee for, or of a similar ilk. Can Rick or Kevin? No question. This gentleman right here.
Thank you. Victor Stone, I wonder about your opinion, if I may, on my thought that perhaps the reason that so much money has gone into political battles is, and I think a couple of you have alluded to this, that the federal government and the state governments, but particularly the federal government, is spending so much money, and it has so many employees that it's not like there's a status quo while you throw ideas out there. This enormous ball is rolling down the mountain, and so both sides want to get some control of it before their idea is lost forever, because it's been, I mean, I think for a while, the charter schools almost got lost in that. I mean, there's a lot of ideas that almost got lost as this huge ball and lots of salaries which fund other contributions from individuals goes rolling down the mountain. And so it seems to me that it's not at all illogical to say, as government got huge after the 60s and 70s, spending money not just on the ideas, but to have some say in whether the ball rolled straight or veered off to one side, was not improper, or unusual.
Along those lines, and this will have to be our last set of responses, but to Lenore's point about compassionate conservatism in this debate, it wasn't Bush that politicized, right, civil society, these little civil society institutes. As Scott was pointing out, they were politicized by a government that was trying to regulate them out of existence, or at least make their life extremely difficult in the course of building a regulatory apparatus that was increasingly intrusive. And Bush's point was, no, we need to protect those little institutions, and it came out in his case, and as it often does, it comes out of a very deep personal experience. It came out of his experience as a reformed alcoholic. He discovered that in those small, in the 12-step program, that was, which is, avidly apolitical. That was an essential piece of civil society that could be very helpful. But anyway, responses to this question, and then we'll.
Yeah, I'm inclined to see it a little bit more in normal patronage terms. That the Republicans get their crack and the Democrats get their crack, and I think you're maybe a little more charitable to Bush's impulses than I would be. But I think on the question of trying to influence the flow of government money, I mean, if you're progressive, and I'm collapsing a lot of nuances here. You generally believe, and I know a lot of people in this room don't, but I do, that the government, through democratic processes and tax expenditures, ought to be responsible for a safety net below the people who need it most. And so, that while private charity is very important, and by the way, I would not accept the notion, and I'm not sure that this is what underlies some of the comments, that progressives are any less civically engaged in that way. So you have all black churches and all kinds of institutions which generally vote in a progressive way and favor bigger government. There's no inconsistency between people running a soup kitchen or trying to help their neighbor and also believing that the government ought to provide health insurance and so on. Now, we have some serious disagreements philosophically about some of that stuff, which can't help but come out in this conversation, but I don't think it's a question of progressives want the government to do everything so they have no connection to their community. It's not that way at all. Sometimes people's lived experience with community problems leads them to wish to shake government off and be totally independent, and sometimes it leads them in a different direction. And the problem I have with a lot of conservatives is they're all for the will of the people, the voice of the people, unless what the people want is more government, which is often what they actually do want. So, so I think there's a consistency philosophically, anyway, with my approach to philanthropy, which is a lot of what we did was, yes, recognize that for some of the most fundamental things, which obviously include defense and security, but I think also include a lot of social safety net things, what you can accomplish through democratically controlled, the government is not independent of all of us, expenditures is a great deal more through, let us say, what was accomplished with some aspects of the stimulus program or health care or child health care than all the philanthropic and charitable dollars in the world add up could do. So yes, we liked to use our money to leverage, to use a very philanthropic kind of term, to leverage those larger flows of money.
I want to make one point that's actually not an answer to this, and then one point that is, because I think it's one point that we never really got into. I think it was a distinctive part, at least what I would consider to be both the modern and the classical forms of philanthropy, which is the relationship to grantees, which I think actually, again, going through basically Jim's, file cabinet, was really more of a relationship of solidarity, right? That is, a lot of the trends that both I and Bill have criticized in philanthropy are really about imagining the relationship between the grantee and the foundation as a contractual relationship, right? I'm buying something, you're going to deliver this, and then I'm going to measure you and figure out whether you delivered it, right? And that's a very different relationship than a solidarity relationship, right? To say, look, you're doing work that I believe in, right? We're partners in that work, right? And we're lashed together. We're tied together doing this work. We're part of the same movement. We're part of the same, and that gives you a very different sense. And I think that really was the relationship that characterized the modern period. And that is exactly what's in danger when you start incorporating these models and metrics, which carry with them a contractual kind of relationship. The only other point I would put is that a lot of the things that you critique and that I also am not in favor of are the unintended consequence of pushing government activism into highly indirect, roundabout kinds of ways, right? So, that all the difficulties that have been associated with Catholic institutions and whether there's a mandate to provide abortion are all a consequence of working through this weird, kludgy system of trying to get health care by mandating organizations. So then you have to stipulate, well, what it is that you're mandating, right? And that has to include something, right? And it's either going to include these things or it's not, right? I mean, if you simply had, single payer or, whatever it is, right, you wouldn't have that, right? A lot of these regulations and huge regulatory complications come from trying to actually produce very large government outcomes, right? With very complicated, indirect kind of ways. In lots of cases, what would be better for liberty would be much larger spending programs, right? But they were much more direct in going at their object rather than ones that are trying to squeeze a huge amount of government activism out of a small amount of dollar, right? And that's where, you do that, and the only thing that makes that equation solve is lots of regulation.
So we're going to voucherize everything?
I'm not entirely against that.
Okay, we might find some agreement there.
Let me very quickly respond to this.
Give it to people.
I think this point is exactly right. This is the problem with the Hayek strategy of working to the next generation. By the time you get there, the ball has moved so far that you're further behind than when you started. The stimulus was about $400 billion per year, $800 billion over 2 years. I believe that the total charitable giving in the United States in a single year is far less than $100 billion. So if this is the point that Garrow is making, yes, government in its spending totally dwarfs charitable giving. It is interesting that government got into this. When the government got into this business, the federal government organized itself like a big foundation. In other words, it makes grants. It makes grants to all these subsidiary units and tries to control them through this grant-making process. This is one of the reasons why we have this sludgy process and result. because all this has to be done indirectly through this grant-making process.
Lenore, last comment?
Oh, okay, no.
No? Okay. No, that's fine. Good.
That-
All right.
that was profound. Thank you.
Let's give our panel a hand.
Thank you.
That's a great point.
About the government, yes.
Well, that's great. I mean, right, that and it also then creates, I mean, obviously all these retinue of retainers on government.
How
I
you
mean,
doing?
the interesting actual thing,
Hello.
so I edited this book called Conservatism in American Political Development. They had a great essay on largely on the ESCA. Why does it why did it end up looking that way? And originally, liberals wanted
fantastic.
basically just essentially general revenue support for poor districts, and conservatives are the ones who insisted that they have basically all these categorical spending programs, because they thought, if we can do that, then we're going to limit it. But it turned out to be the opposite, right? It turned out that what happened was those categories allowed you to create organizations where at every single one of the
May I come
categories
up
was
from
made
around the
impossible
table to
by
chat
the
with you?
change.
That would be more comfortable.